There are some points in history which revolve around small clusters of individuals. And if those individuals had made different choices, pursued different strategies, walked out of a meeting or had a poorly timed nervous breakdown, the world we live in today could look unrecognisable to us. I'm currently sat in the James Connolly Centre on Falls Road in West Belfast, and had our next guest made different decisions, this neighbourhood, this city, these counties could very well still be a war zone. For years, it would have been illegal for us to even broadcast his voice, let alone sit down to talk with him. He was a terrorist in the eyes of our government, who went on to shake the hands of the now King Charles. He steered the Irish Republican cause from armed struggle to talks at the top table, and even now, he is a deeply polarising figure. For many people, he's a peacemaker, a civil rights icon. For others, he's impossible to separate from the darkest days of the Troubles and the disappearances and killings of the Provisional IRA. When I told people I was doing this interview, invariably I was met by a sharp intake of breath. He is possibly the single most historically consequential figure we've ever interviewed on Downstream. I hope you enjoy the interview as much as I enjoyed conducting it. Gerry Adams, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you. Thank you very much for travelling all this way, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion.
Well, you might not be so gracious by the time we've finished. Let's see. From 1988, for years your voice was banned from the airwaves. Is that why you've now become a podcaster, to make up for lost time?
No, I was tricked into being a podcaster by the people who ordered me about the place. And I'm not a true podcaster, to be fair. You know, I basically waffle for 25 minutes.
That sounds like podcasting to me.
Well, maybe so, and look at events, but I don't put a huge amount of creativity or time into it. But I do think it's an interesting concept. The whole social media concept for me, when I first went on Twitter eons ago, seemed to me to be very democratic. You know, if you're dealing with the media, even media or journalists who would be fair and decent, you have to leave it to them. Like, their editorial judgment, they'll make the cuts, they'll put out whatever, unless it's live, they'll put out whatever they decide, or their editors decide. But in the world of social media, you're the editor. You can make a mistake, or you can say whatever you say without the constraints that we normally would face. And I think in other parts of the world, it has a huge effect, positive effect, and advocacy and mobilising people and reaching people who otherwise would not be empowered. At the same time, of course, the right wing and other elements can exploit it for their own purposes as well. But I very much welcome the notion that you can have control, and you're the person who decides what you want to say, and not someone else. Has
your experience of media hostility changed? I mean, you recently won a libel case. Were you surprised by how hard the BBC fought it? I mean, they spent an awful lot of money.
No, not at all. You see, you do have these out-of-body experiences, and you sometimes wonder. I mean, I always thought, and still think, that I'm, a nice enough person. I have my flaws and faults, like everybody else. And then all of a sudden you meet someone who you've never met before, but they don't even have the good manners to let you say 3 sentences in a row. And we went through all the silliness of refusing to shake hands, and at its core, you see, it's very political. I mean, if we were children who were refusing to socialise with other children, you would be saying, "Now, catch yourself on, go and play there. That's a nice wee boy, that's a nice wee girl." But in the world of Ireland, and I'm sure in other parts of the world, the establishment rules, and I'm minded all the time of what the English said when they first came to Ireland. They came to civilise the barbarians.
I think we heard that one as well.
And that was what the empire did. You know, it was the largest empire on the planet in the history of humanity. And all these governments which go into other people's countries, they don't say, you know, we're there because you've got oil. We're there because you have mineral resources. You're there because strategically we want to keep you down or make sure alliances aren't formed which are against our national interests. No, they say we're there because you're communists or you're terrorists, or in our case, you're barbarians. Now at that time, Ireland had a very, 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 very advanced society and structure. Wasn't perfect, but by its own time, it reflected a culture which was about learning, which was about education, which had laws called the Brehon laws, you know, which were as equal as you would get for the time that was, and particularly around the issue of women, particularly around the issue of marriage. Like a woman could, on this year anniversary, a woman could divorce just by saying, I'm going to divorce.
Quickly going back to the media, Sinn Féin in the South has struggled to break the two-party duopoly, right? You know, you've got Fine Gael, you've got Fianna Fáil, and the best that Sinn Féin's been able to do is form a, you know, largest party, but there's still been the marriage of convenience between the two main ones. Do you see the media in having had a role in that? Is there a hostility that Sinn Féin has to face that other parties don't have to contend with?
Well, first of all, had we been doing this interview 25 years ago, and had I said to you that we would have the situation where Sinn Féin is the largest party on the island of Ireland, that Sinn Féin under Mairead MacDonald leads the opposition in the Dáil, that a Tyrone woman is the First Minister in a statelet which was carved out to prevent ever in perpetuity anyone who wasn't a unionist being in a position of parliamentary leadership, or that we would have the strongest team of MPs, and so on and so forth. So there has been huge progress made. There's also been a realignment of politics, north and south. So there have been seismic advances made on, you know, the issue of divorce, on the issue of women's rights, on the issue of abortion and other matters. And we had, from partition and from the Civil War, a two-party system, mostly Fianna Fáil in power, but swapping every so often. And the differences between them were rhetorical. They did, in the beginning of their formation, represent slightly different class elements, you know, big businesses as opposed to small farmers and so on and so forth. But they just monopolized power for all of that time. It's interesting that the last time there was a single party government in the South was during the hunger strikes, when the Republican prisoners contested elections in the South. And two of them were elected, a man called Paddy Agnew, who was a prisoner, and Kieran Doherty, who was also elected as a TD and who was a hunger striker from Andersonstown here, who died on hunger strike. And there has not been a single party in governance since then. So what they did to defend their own self-interest, and partition runs deep. A man called Liam Mellows, who was executed by the Free State government way back in the 1920s during the Civil War. During the debate about the treaty, and the treaty was the instrument that the British negotiated out, and which divided the island and set up a free state, which remained with Dominion status under the British system, but which had limited powers. Liam Mellows said, if this treaty goes through, men will get into power. And when men get into power, they will not want to give up that power. And that's what's happening now. I mean, it was very prophetic. So Sinn Féin have changed with others the political landscape, but we haven't yet succeeded in persuading people that there is a pathway from where we currently are into government.
Well, and why do you think that is? Because you look at Sinn Féin's economic programme, right? It's speaking to issues that a lot of young people are contending with, particularly on housing, on jobs and opportunities. But is there a bit of a tension between what Mary Lou McDonald has to do, which is present herself as a consensus building kind of figure, and the sort of confrontational nature of economic populism? Is there an inherent tension with what she has to do because of, Sinn Féin is still a very polarising political party for many people, and then also the polarisation you have to do to make economic populism work?
Well, I don't think we're engaged in economic populism. The fact is that the southern state is one of the wealthiest states around the place, but you can't judge the quality of life in your state by the number of millionaires you have. It has to be about how the lowest class gets treated. So we have a huge homelessness crisis. We have a crisis in the public health services. There's hardly a month goes past that there isn't some scandal around other public services or legacy issues around how people were treated and children were treated or others were treated in institutions of the state. So what we have to do, obviously, is to continue to do what we're doing, but to do it better. We also have to look to others of like mind. My sort of political life experience is, and this was always the case now, even before Sinn Féin had one vote in my lifetime, there are tons of people out there, rivers of people out there, who share the same vision as we do. They want fairness, they want decency, they want public services, they want everyone treated on the basis of equality, and they want the state and the economy working for the people, not the other way around. So what we have to do is to connect with those people who have that same vision. They don't have to agree on every dot. Sometimes what the left does is get caught up in the minutiae of an issue, and I know detail is important when you're negotiating or you're trying to form some manifesto. But in terms of the general concepts, there are more people out there, and sometimes they're not involved in political organisations. At least they're not involved in party political organisations. They are involved in volunteerism. They are involved in working with people with disabilities, with children, with elderly people. There's a big problem in rural Ireland in terms of disconnect and isolation and the lack of infrastructure. So we just have to find a comfortable space with all of those people. And if you are a United Irelander, and I firmly believe that leaving aside the righteousness of the right of the people of the island of Ireland to self-determine their own future, leaving that aside for a moment, it's also good for us. It doesn't make sense to have on a small island, like there are more people living in London, you know, on a small island like this, that we have separate systems, in most cases, notwithstanding the progress made under the Good Friday Agreement, in most cases, facing away from each other. So it makes sense to have a single public health service across the island of Ireland. It makes sense to have Ireland as a single economic unit. It makes sense to have a single agricultural entity, and so on through all the different elements of what makes a society decent and fair for the people who live here. That's our challenge, to connect with those people.
But I was talking to a friend of mine who's from your part of the world, right? It's from Ballymurphy, and they're my age, right? So they're basically a child of the peace. And what they said to me is that despite growing up in a very strongly Republican family and having very strongly held Republican socialist beliefs, they'd be too scared of risking the peace to go all in for unification. There is something about the gains that you were part of securing, right, a permanent, hopefully, end to armed conflict that felt like too much to gamble on an actual political process towards unification and a referendum.
Well, there may be people there who do have a concern in terms of, you know, the potential of the threat from extreme loyalism.
Do you have that concern?
No, I wouldn't take it for granted for a second, but what is the relationship between these extreme loyalist groups historically, and one could argue currently, and the British system? The loyalists never acted outside of the 1920s of their own accord. This state was created on the back of a coup led by the British Army. You know, the Curragh Mutiny, the machinations going on between the main parties at Westminster, and, you know, they decided we'd play the orange card. So very rarely have loyalism, even though they do have their own agenda in terms of their violent actions, very rarely have they acted outside of the broad control of British security agencies. I mean, the UDA was formed by the British Army. The UVF was rejuvenated by the British Army. In all of the high-profile cases, like there's a huge case at the moment around a man called Sean Brown, who was chairperson of a local Gaelic athletic club in Balahi, and he was shot to death. He was shot just because he was a prominent Gael, he wasn't a Republican, certainly he had no affiliations with Sinn Féin or any of the rest of that. Not that that would have been a good reason, but the man was shot to death. The British government is now blocking his family having proper investigations. Keir Starmer, who had nothing to do with any of this, is blocking Ben, the Secretary of State, is blocking investigations because of the amount of British agents who were involved in that killing. Pat Finucane, famously a human rights lawyer, you know, of any of the investigations, even the half-assed ones, were subject to all sorts of redactions and so on and so forth. They all say Pat was killed as a result of collusion. He was killed at the behest of British state agencies. So that connection is deep. Now, are there disaffected, I mean, I live here in the city of Belfast, are there disaffected loyalists? Are there disadvantaged neighbourhoods, communities? Of course there are. We suffered the nonsense this year, and you can nearly see it from the window here, of a big bonfire which had asbestos in it, right? And also which was between two transformers, which were hooked into the two local main hospitals in the statelet. But that became the argument. I mean, it's ridiculous, you know, that should still be happening in this day and age. What did the PSNI say? We won't protect the contractors who the city council had employed to take down the bonfire.
I mean, so like on exactly that point, I mean, if you're someone who's living in the south of Ireland, you know, let's say we've gotten to the point where there is a cross-border referendum, how do you think they're going to look at the idea of forming one political unity with the North, which is a very different political culture, very different policing culture? You've said, you know, there are still these pockets of disaffected loyalists. You know, you might be an Irish nationalist in your identity, but when you're asked to put a cross in a box that could profoundly impact your own quality of life, peace of mind.
Well, what is the quality of life? The quality of life, it's obviously we're a first world country. So there's nothing compares to what's happening in the Middle East or what's happening in Africa or other parts of the world. But the British government control what's going on here, even if we wanted to make changes which would bring in egalitarian values into any of the needs that people have within society. The British government will block that. They control all of that. But look, let's get to the nub of the question. The nub of the question, I would say, the answer to all of these concerns is talk. That's the answer to all those. So I'm a loyalist. I'm actually a Republican, so there's nothing going to persuade me that there's any better system than us having our own governance in our own land and doing whatever the people decide they want. So there are unionists who would have the same view, for whatever reason, that they believe in the union. Right? If the people vote for the union to end, are they going to rise up? Remember, all of the parties have signed up to the Good Friday Agreement. All of the parties have agreed to abide by the outcome of any unity referendum. So what are the concerns? As they express them, and they, not me, are the people who need to express them, it's about their sense of Britishness. So let's hear, because if you're British, and you feel you're British and you are British, then, well, that's not going to change. You know, because the sovereignty issue has been resolved on democratic lines doesn't mean that you don't have the right to feel British, be British, and whatever that's required. And then if there are identity issues, you know, is it going to be reduced down to a bonfire? Is it going to be reduced down to parading and so on? All of those issues can be resolved. On terms of the benefits, and remember, you went through the experience of Brexit. So bouncing people in a referendum is not the way to go. You need to plan, you need to look at all the issues and then find ways of resolving those to everybody's satisfaction and to everybody's benefit. So I think that the big challenge for all of us as we're trying to plan the future is to actually plan the future, is to actually plan it. So there will be a referendum. Now, the unionists might want to pretend there's not going to be a referendum, and there have been some voices from within unionism who are saying, look, let's face up to this. There is going to be a referendum, let's prepare for it. They're the sensible heads. They're the people who will bring some sense to all of this. Tactically, unionist leaders probably say, look, if we start, we'll be on the slippery slope. If we move on to discuss anything other than the status quo, then we're gone. That isn't necessarily the case. And you also have to consider the type of change that has happened here, and it's all work in progress. And I have come around in the last 10, 20 years to the very firm view that struggle is a continuum, and it goes on forever. Right? It doesn't stop. There'll always be people who need help. There'll always changes be required. Society will need reshape. So that's gonna, those of us who are activists, that's gonna
permanent revolution. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Well, it's there is no perfect society, but the need to continue. You know, you will do okay. Right? Generally speaking, you will do okay. But there are people who will not do okay and who need help from people like you and me and everybody else that can bring some sense to all of this. So the British government cannot dodge its responsibilities. The British government, I mean, this is my firm view, and on to the day I die, British government has no right to be in Ireland at all. Never had any right to be here and never will have any right to be here. The Good Friday Agreement gave us an accommodation which is based upon a process in which we have not agreed the destination. We're on a journey, but we haven't agreed the terminal or the point that the journey will end. And that's why the British government has a responsibility, and the Irish government particularly has a responsibility to plan the future.
I mean, when it comes to, if you can put yourself back in the moment of negotiating the Good Friday Agreement and everything that led up to that point in 1998, what was more difficult? Was it dealing with the British government, or was it dealing with opposition within your own movement? What was the hardest thing?
Well, first of all, I think it's true to say that the hardest negotiation can be with your own side. So what's key is to have your own side as deeply empowered in the process of strategizing. They don't all have to know what the next move is. They don't need to be able to plot out every step on the way, but they have to be able to make sense of the strategic direction in which you're going. And that means that you have to democratically set strategic objectives. So you have your principal objective. Principal objective of Sinn Féin is an Irish Republic on the island of Ireland. We can't have that while the Union remains. So not only is it the right thing to do to get rid of the Union, but it's also a necessary step in the process of democratising life for the people on the island of Ireland.
There were huge tactical differences in how you achieved that strategic goal. How did you navigate that on your own side?
But first of all, we were blessed with the continuity of leadership. So that's important, that we had a bunch of people who were together in the struggle for most of their adult lives.
Yourself, Martin McGuinness,
the whole team of men and women. So that's one aspect. Secondly, there was a communal uprising here in 1969. There was almost a popular uprising between 69 and maybe 71. On the back of internment, on the back of bloody Sunday and so on, back of the Ballymurphy massacres. So a lot of people from these communities were invested in the struggle. Now, they mightn't have been the people who would stand up and make a big speech, but they did understand. And women particularly, I found, throughout my whole life, women particularly understood what was required. So we came to a realization that on its part, the IRA could fight the British forever, and vice versa. The British Army could probably fight the IRA for forever. And there was resistance. And resistance wasn't just armed resistance, although that was obviously part of it, but it was, you've been stopped in the street and given your name in Irish. You know, it was you intervening because some young people were being beaten up by a British Army patrol. It was going on a protest. It was signing a petition. It was marching on behalf of prisoners or against curfew or whatever, for civil rights or whatever the issue was. So you had, in most parts of the Republican North, a section of the community which was invested in struggle, and who, broadly speaking, might have had difficulties with some of the steps that had to be taken, but understood the strategic context of what was being attempted, and also had sufficient confidence in the leadership, not to trust the leadership completely, because nobody trusts anybody completely, but that it was a leadership that was part of the base, that the two were interconnected in a very, very clear way. So, you know, people left us, there were disagreements, but the vast majority of Republican activists stayed with the struggle and were able to, when we got to the point where we decided that negotiations were a means of struggle, and that's a big step change, you know, that a mode of struggle, that advances could be made within negotiations. And then, of course, as with the election particularly of Bobby Sands, that electoralism increasingly became part of the Republican struggle, so that the struggle wasn't dependent just on the IRA, that there was this popular base which could not be ignored, or at least could only be ignored by the British government putting itself in the dock.
Did you ever experience self-doubt? I mean, I know that you were, you know, a long-time Sinn Féin activist and very committed to the political struggle, but being part of making the decision that it was time to abandon the joint strategy of politics and armed struggle and commit entirely to political negotiation, were there ever moments of self-doubt? Were there moments of worry that it wasn't the right thing to do? Communities were left defenseless, that the state would stitch you up? Well,
first of all, any person who doesn't have self-doubt doesn't deserve to be in leadership. You know, any person who doesn't have regrets or who doesn't recognize mistakes that have been made and tries to rectify them. So of course one would have, you know, concerns about is this the right course of action? But if you stay united, it is possible that even if you make a mistake, that if you stay united, you can sit down and talk about it and you can rectify the mistake. The other thing, and I say this, and I know it sounds a bit provocative, right? I always felt when I was meeting British representatives that we were morally superior to them on the issue of the rights of the people of this island to live together in peace and freedom. I always, no matter how nice the Englishman was, who was Prime Minister, most suffered from that disease that comes from being a former colonial power, that you think in some way you're superior to the people that you have governed for centuries. And I always felt that, maybe not so much that we were morally superior, but that our demands, our cause, was more just than theirs. That our cause was about bringing people through empowerment into having the very best lives possible in their own country, and having peace and harmony, and, you know, minding people, and also internationally, doing the same on the world stage, even for a small island like ourselves. So I always had that sense, and that's probably no bad thing.
I mean, but when you sit here and you talk to me, you come across as very open, very confident. And when I go back and I read the history of the struggle and the things that you guys experienced, you had to deal with infiltration, you had to deal with comrades being offered vast sums of money to inform on you, you had to deal with being bugged, you had to deal with assassination attempts. Did that impact you emotionally and psychologically? Because you've used words like trust, trust in leadership, trust in each other, solidarity, togetherness. But there was a huge atmosphere of suspicion because of the activities of the security state, no?
Well, there wasn't. All of those instruments of the state, like the special branch were set up first to deal with the Fenians. That's where it came from. The British Army came from Cromwell's new army. And that's where that came from. And you could go through the whole sort of connexes in British coercion in Ireland, because for whatever reason, the British couldn't suppress fully the Irish desire. There was always what commonly called a respectable minority that were prepared to, Bobby Sands and the other hunger strikers are a modern example of that. Just that unbreakable spirit of we want to be free and we have the right to be free. So, of course, then they recruit people to work for them. Of course they do.
But how did that make you feel, right? Like yours was a movement that required high levels of trust.
No, trust. I mean, I do trust, obviously, my comrades, and trust the instinct and the broad base of people that I work with. But our history is so replete with informers, with agents, with people being turned, with people being compromised, with people being blackmailed. Very few people end up working for the enemy, if I can use that term, of their own accord, or because they're convinced. There might be some who have given up on the cause, but mostly it's people who were caught in a certain, I suppose, difficult situation for themselves, and then that's exploited. So that's as long as the history. That's how it works. That's Cain and Abel. That's the way the thing functions, and you just have to accept that, and then make sure that the people who you're working with are the very, very, so I could say without fear of contradiction that I have no doubt about the people who were in the broad leadership of the Republican struggle and who were part of developing it to where we are now, that I would trust them all. Are there people close to them? So they, if the Brits can't turn somebody that's working with me, then they'll try and turn a driver. They'll try and turn some friend of the driver. They'll try and, so somebody can be. And they also did saturation intelligence gathering. When the British Army were on the streets, they used to call it census taking, and they would have asked people questions like, which might have sounded idiotic at the time, like, what colour's your wallpaper? What colour's your bedroom door? And they build up this sort of micro knowledge of communities and the people who live within them and all of that crack. But I just take it as a given. Look, politicians don't trust each other. People in love relationships sometimes don't trust each other. Business people don't trust each other. As part of the human condition. And I would say for the number of people, and I don't know how many, but for the number of people who were fooled, tricked, cajoled, blackmailed, threatened into working for the British, there are hundreds of thousands who weren't, who stayed true, and who realised that the only way to go forward is to go forward.
Were there elements of yourself that you had to repress or discipline to be the kind of leader that the Republican cause needed? So whether it was fear or, we talked about self-doubt and there being a healthy level of self-doubt, but there's also self-doubt which leads to paralysis. It's emotionally very demanding what you had to do. Did you have to discipline yourself internally to be able to do it? Well, I haven't recently done any detailed self-analysis, but I've always seen myself as a team player, and I've always seen myself as a team builder, and I in my head, it works back from your primary objective to your intermediate or strategic objectives. You need structure, you need capacity, you need the most skillful people that you can find. And one of the big things that probably hasn't been properly analysed, the bulk of the people who were involved in the IRA and who actually brought the British government to the negotiating table were mostly working class. Mostly. Now there were supporters and there were IRA people who obviously were middle class and who came from the professions, but the bulk were working class people. And there's such a wealth of wisdom and craft and integrity within the working class across the island of Ireland, rural and urban, and it's the same in your own country and everywhere. If you can create the conditions where those people have a sense of their own power, a sense of their own empowerment. So it may be that because people are enjoying the peace, and they should enjoy the peace, that some might be a bit concerned about, where we go. But for those who are thinking their way through it, a real republic on the island of Ireland, and that's not the business of the British, by the way. How we govern ourselves is our business. But self-determination for the people of the island of Ireland, which is part of the Good Friday Agreement, is the way to go. Trust the people, let the people make the decision on how we should move forward beyond partition and beyond the union with England. So you say things like, I was a team player, I worked backwards from my strategic objectives, and I go, yeah, I can see all that, but if someone shot me in the neck, it would pretty much go out the window because I would be experiencing trauma. I mean, when these things happened, how do you as a human being process that experience when it's happening?
Because I wasn't the only one. I mean, in my own family, my sister Frances, who has since died, was pregnant to her husband, who was called Patrick Mulvanna, who was an IRA volunteer, and he was shot dead when she was 6 months pregnant, with the huge consequences of that. My cousin Kieran Murphy was picked up by one of these loyalist death squads and butchered and left. He was coming out of a traditional music session. He was left dead. Our neighbours in Ballymurphy were killed. So if it was just me, it would be unique, but it wasn't. I mean, I came into this office and I meet a guy who was 21 years in jail. 21 years, think about it. 21 years in jail, and yet he's out. He's enthusiastic. He's talking to Orange men. He's talking to loyalists. He's trying to make sense of the future. He's contributing to his community. He's a councillor in Belfast City Council. So there are multiple examples. There's a new generation, of course, as you have said, which is post the Good Friday Agreement, who, unless they have a family connection to that, or indeed unless their family suffered, because we shouldn't for a second minimize the number of people who were killed or injured in the course of the conflict. So their relatives obviously have a different take, perhaps, than others. But if it was just me, yes, it would be Cone, pity me, poor me. But it wasn't. It was the way things were.
Did it desensitize you to violence, or did it do the opposite, having those experiences in your family?
No, part of the argument that I got involved in, debate might be a more diplomatic word, was there were the politics of condemnation, the politics of denunciation. So these terrorists are beyond appeal. And I don't know if you know the origins of the term beyond appeal. It was a small area around Dublin, which was the main concentration of English power on the island of Ireland. But for everybody else, beyond appeal was a compliment. I mean, it's actually reversed in its psychology. But all these descriptions of denunciation, of condemnation, and then this ridiculous position of not talking to people and not being parroted by church leaders, by the great and the good, by political representatives, by governments. And I started to argue with others, and most strikingly and productively with a man called Alex Reid and Des Wilson, who were both Catholic priests based here. If you want the IRA to go away, forget about the condemnations, because they think they're right. Get an alternative. So that became a focus of work that I did with them, and then later famously with John Hume, and it moved on to engaging others. And that's I think the key to all of this. If you look at other parts of the world, you have to ask the question, why can't that work in other parts of the world? Now, it's also, let me say, the British didn't want to do a deal with Sinn Féin. The British government didn't want a peace agreement. They saw peace as being the defeat of Irish republicanism, and some within unionism probably saw it as the defeat of Irish republicanism and the continuation of the status quo, maybe tinkered up a wee bit, but generally speaking, the same thing. So it's how we were able to then develop that argument. And the biggest difficulty, although it did have challenges, wasn't in persuading the Republicans, although that was challenging. It was persuading the two governments. Both governments, and the Irish government were as bad as the British government on certain aspects of it, persuading them that we could have talks. For example, the Good Friday Agreement was negotiated without the unionist parties talking formally to Sinn Féin. They went through all those negotiations, and I used to joke, the only talk that I ever had with unionists was when we met in the men's room, because the more suppose reasoned ones would have had, they would have said, hello, how are you doing, how's things? But there was no discussion. It was all close proximity talks. It was George Mitchell going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and then subsequently, under his leadership, Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern doing much of the same. So how much more advanced would we be if we had that business of dialogue being front and centre of all of what we may do?
I want to move on a little bit. Amongst Westminster journalists, the phrase Gerry Adams was never in the IRA is a punchline to them. Why do you think they find it so hard to believe?
I don't really care.
You don't care?
No, I don't mind. It's up to them.
I mean, you mind a bit, right? You fight libel cases when you're misrepresented.
Yeah, well, I believe in standing up for people, and that includes standing up for myself. So, you know, the British Broadcasting Corporation is exactly that. It's the British Broadcasting Corporation. It reflects the values of the British state, and that's okay if you're in Britain, but it reflects those values here in Ireland. So, you know, the British Broadcasting Corporation and the RTE, the Irish Broadcasting Corporation, they still refer to the IRA as terrorists. They still talk about them as gangs. You know, there's no, you know, that's what comes out, and they are not held accountable. And I've taken just 2 libel cases, and both cases that I took, we won the case, and I think that was a good thing.
But you have also said that, you know, you've been very clear in your consistent statement that you were never in the IRA, but you've also said, of course, that there are things that you regret, that mistakes were made, and you've also met with many victims and families of victims of IRA violence. Where does your sense of responsibility begin and end?
Well, for better or worse, and I use this term advisedly, not in any sort of self-vanity. For better or worse, I was a leader in the course of this struggle. And I've made the case that I believe in the collective, and I'm a team builder and I'm part of a team, and I believe in democratic centralism, and I believe that politics has to empower people. So, as a leader, I have to take responsibility. There was no way around that. One of my big regrets is that it took so long to get a peace process in place. And I first wrote about this issue of peace and what peace is or was in 1976. So how far is it from 1976 to 19? When was the Good Friday Agreement?
98.
98, so how many years is that? That's 22 years. How long were John Hume and I talking privately? For 8, 9, 10 years perhaps before we got, because the governments had set themselves against. Now, the issue of victims, sometimes the term victims is used in a very general way. Now, they obviously have, all of the victims have certain things in common. One, that they were bereaved, families were bereaved, or people were killed, or people were injured by all of the combatant forces. And also through incarceration, through interrogation, through unlawful detentions, and all of that. And some of them come at it in different ways. Some of the best peacemakers and peacekeepers are victims. Some of the people who are prepared to stretch themselves are people who have suffered grievously. Others, it's been too traumatic. They've never come to terms with the loss of a loved one, and one can understand that. And then some people just want to get on with their lives. It's just, whatever has happened, and you know, most, I would think, would value the peace. Most would have that sense. So among those who I've met, and probably the majority of them are, who have met in a formal sense or even a semi-formal sense, would be victims of the IRA. Now, I obviously meet victims of the British forces, like they're my friends or my neighbours, or
Or yourself? You were interned?
Yeah. Well, I was just to go off on a tangent and coming back to Mr. Starmer. There were about perhaps as many as 300 to 400 haven't been up for all night and perhaps had very limited sleep for the 4 or 5 nights before that. I had to speak down in Carrickmore, which is in County Tyrone, very strong Republican heartland, at an Easter commemoration. And I wasn't in trepidation because, I had enough confidence in our own, I suppose, cause and what we were doing tactically. But I was concerned about how people who had suffered might respond to this. And the first 2 people I met as I got out of the car were 2 women, Mrs. Gormley and Mrs. Arthurs, who had lost their sons. They were former they were IRA volunteers, and they were shot dead by the British. And both of them embraced me, and both of them told me that we were doing the right thing. And that's for me was just, it's just symbolically, it was a coincidence that they were there. That there wasn't a coincidence they were there, but they were the first person to meet me. That was a reassurance, because if these people, these women, particularly mothers, who had suffered so grievously, were prepared to give this a go, then that showed we were in the right path.
When you look at what's happening in Gaza and you look at the Palestinian cause, how does your own experience of being part of that shift from an armed struggle to a wholly political one, do you think that would ever be possible in that context?
I find it very difficult to articulate the awfulness of what's happening in Gaza. Where every morning, every day, every hour, you have genocide on your iPhone. You now have starvation being used. That was used here as well, famously in the Great Hunger. So there are lots of parallels between the struggle of the Palestinian people and the struggle of the Irish people, which is why there is so much support for the Palestinian cause in Ireland, that people recognise those parallels.
And this is my first time in Belfast. It's my first time in West Belfast. And one of the things that struck me walking around is every street has 2 or 3 houses with giant Palestinian flags on them. Huge. So many murals. I've spoken to people before about the sense of connection between the Irish struggle and the Palestinian one, but it's an entirely different thing when you see it.
Well, I feel like crying now. It's in our hearts. It's just terrible what's happening, and the British Prime Minister's arming the bombs. They can get engaged in all the rhetoric, all the sort of speaking out of both sides of their mouths, but they're giving very, very active support. American bombs are being dropped. The White House, the United States administration, are providing the armaments which are being used almost exclusively, as far as I can see, against civilian and children and hospitals and all the places that are supposed to be not part of the normal rules of war, if there is such a construct. So when you boil it all down, all that's required is to uphold international law. But that seems to be impossible for these big powers. And the upholding of international law, against the occupation, against the settlements, against the way people's rights are being set to one side, and particularly against a war effort that is aimed at, I'm firmly of the view that they want to rid Gaza of the Palestinians. They want to have this is Netanyahu wants to have a single Israeli state, and he's been supported in that by President Trump and by Keir Starmer and others, the French and the Germans and so on and so forth. And it's just fundamentally wrong.
Spicy question time. Do you see a parallel or any parallels between the provisional IRA and militant Palestinian movements like Hamas? Because you've talked about international law. I mean, you've been proximate to armed struggles against occupations. They couldn't abide by international law when they were doing it.
It's back to school time, and Grocery Outlet has all the savings on Lunchbox Lifesavers. This week, save on Armour Lunch Makers assorted varieties for only 99 cents each. That's up to 50% less than traditional grocery stores. And save even more on sliced fruit on-the-go fruit bars. Get 2 4-packs for $1 and save up to 80% versus traditional grocery stores. These tasty, packable snacks will keep your kids and your wallet happy. These deals end August 5th while supplies last. So hurry into your local Grocery Outlet today.
Grocery Outlet, Bargain Market.
Well, I mean, I've been in Gaza, and I've been in Israel and in the Palestinian territories a number of times. And I wouldn't draw any direct parallel between any of the Palestinian armed organizations and the now former Irish Republican Army. There are obvious parallels in relation to armed struggle, but, and I don't want to be too provocative in what I'm saying.
Oh, go on.
Well, the IRA had a capacity which the Palestinians didn't have. But they don't have the capacity. They are a poor people. They don't have they may have the support of people internationally, but they don't have the support of the powerful elements in the global village. And I know states like South Africa and our own Irish state has been moved to a position of doing the correct things and doing the right things. So the duty on the international community is not really to get involved in the discussion about the rights and wrongs of armed actions and so on, but to get a ceasefire and to uphold international law. Because if they don't uphold international law, who's going to do it? Who's going to do it? Having been up for all night and perhaps had very limited sleep for the 4 or 5 nights before that, I had to speak down in Carrickmore, which is in County Tyrone, very strong Republican heartland, at an Easter commemoration. And I wasn't in trepidation because I had enough confidence in our own, I suppose, cause and what we were doing tactically. But I was concerned about how people who had suffered might respond to this. And the first 2 people I met as I got out of the car were 2 women, Mrs. Gormley and Mrs. Arthurs, who had lost their sons. They were former IRA volunteers. They were IRA volunteers, and they were shot dead by the British. And both of them embraced me, and both of them told me that we were doing the right thing. And that's for me was just, just symbolically, it was a coincidence that they were there. There wasn't a coincidence they were there, but they were the first person to meet me. That was a reassurance, because of these people, these women, particularly mothers, who had suffered so grievously, were prepared to give this a go, then that showed we were in the right path.
When you look at what's happening in Gaza and you look at the Palestinian cause, how does your own experience of being part of that shift from an armed struggle to a wholly political one, do you think that would ever be possible in that context?
I find it very difficult to articulate the awfulness of what's happening in Gaza. every morning, every day, every hour, you have genocide on your iPhone. You now have starvation being used. That was used here as well, famously in the Great Hunger. So there are lots of parallels between the struggle of the Palestinian people and the struggle of the Irish people, which is why there is so much support for the Palestinian cause in Ireland, that people recognise those parallels.
And this is my first time in Belfast. It's my first time in West Belfast. And one of the things that struck me walking around is every street has 2 or 3 houses with giant Palestinian flags on them. Huge. So many murals. I've spoken to people before about the sense of connection between the Irish struggle and the Palestinian one, but it's an entirely different thing when you see it.
Well, I feel like crying now. Like, it's in our hearts. It's just terrible what's happening, and the British Prime Minister's arming the bombs. They can get engaged in all the rhetoric, all the sort of speaking out of both sides of their mouths, but they're giving very, very active support. American bombs are being dropped. The White House, the United States administration, are providing the armaments which are being used almost exclusively, as far as I can see, against civilian and children and hospitals and all the places that are supposed to be not part of the normal rules of war, if there is such a construct. So when you boil it all down, all that's required is to uphold international law. But that seems to be impossible for these big powers. And the upholding of international law, against the occupation, against the settlements, against the way people's rights are being set to one side, and particularly against a war effort that is aimed at, I'm firmly of the view that they want to rid Gaza of the Palestinians. They want to have this is Netanyahu wants to have a single Israeli state, and he's been supported in that by President Trump and by Keir Starmer and others, the French and the Germans and so on and so forth. And it's just fundamentally wrong.
Spicy question time. Do you see a parallel or any parallels between the provisional IRA and militant Palestinian movements like Hamas? Because you've talked about international law. You've been proximate to armed struggles against occupations. They couldn't abide by international law when they were doing it.
Well, I've been in Gaza, and I've been in Israel and in the Palestinian territories a number of times. And I wouldn't draw any direct parallel between any of the Palestinian armed organizations and the now former Irish Republican Army. There are obvious parallels in relation to armed struggle, but, and I don't want to be too provocative in what I'm saying.
Oh, go on.
Well, the IRA had a capacity which the Palestinians didn't have. But they don't have the capacity. They are a poor people. They don't have they may have the support of people internationally, but they don't have the support of the powerful elements in the global village. And I know states like South Africa and our own Irish state has been moved to a position of doing the correct things and doing the right things. So the duty on the international community is not really to get involved in the discussion about the rights and wrongs of armed actions and so on, but to get a ceasefire and to uphold international law. Because if they don't uphold international law, who's going to do it? Who's going to do it? The British here, and in my lifetime, nothing as bad as what is happening in Gaza happened here, with the concentration and the constant consistency of it all. But in our own history, these things happened. And the British used to say, in matters relating to here, this is an internal matter for the government of the United Kingdom. That they would tell people from the European Union, they would tell people from the USA, they would tell people from other countries, put out, it's none of your business, this is our internal business. It's only when we broke through that, when we internationalized the issue and broke through that, and when President Clinton did the right thing, and when you think about it, it was such a small thing, really. He gave me a visa and he opened up, but it was symbolically very, very powerful because it opened up all sorts of other potentials, and it reinforced the effort that we were making and others were making to try and build peace. So that's the solution in terms, the ultimate solution is that the people of Palestine have the right to their own state. But that's the solution to what's happening at the moment. Stop it. Uphold international law and make a stand on that basis, and stop arming them. Stop arming the Zionists, and stop arming and providing the munitions to those who are causing such disaster. How could people, there is multi-generational grief here. I think it's a real thing, But how could, the people of Gaza just deserve such credit. How could they recover that multi-generational effects of what's happening every single day,
I've got one final question for you. When I think about who I might have been were it not for politics and political journalism, I often think I'd have trained as a chef. That's what I'd have liked to do. I'd like to have trained as a chef. I'd like to feed people. If it weren't for this life-defining political struggle that you've been a part of since you were a very young man, 60 years, as you've said, who do you think you might have been? What kind of person?
Well, I don't know, but I'm not. I do cook.
You have a cookbook.
Yes, I do garden. I write. I love dogs. I have grandchildren. I have lots of friends. I enjoy, as they say here, we drink every so often. I love singing and music. So I have a multiplicity of interests. Sometimes it's hard to fit it all in. So I'm fairly relaxed. You can't change what you're going to do tomorrow. You can't change what you did yesterday. So my life has taken this course, and I have agreed to that. I have been part of that. Did I see all the twists and turns? Did I see all of the difficulties? No, of course I didn't. But you only get one life, and make the most of it, and do your best, and you'll be okay.
And sweep the car for bugs regularly. Would that be the last piece of advice? Because you showed up at Leeds Castle with you and Martin McGuinness were the one that you'd found planted.
Yeah. That actually was quite a funny thing. I'll finish on this. So we found this big bug in the Sinn Féin headquarters in Belfast here, just in Andersonstown, right? So I had this mad idea that we should bring it back to Tony Blair. And Martin McGuinness said to me, "You're on your own." I'm not part of that. I said, "No, let's put it up to him." So we got Alex Maskey, who was one of our representatives, still is, and he travelled over with this bug. It was long, like it was about 4 foot long. It was on a joist in a ceiling joist in a room. So we walked across. It was actually like a funeral procession. There were whatever the Sinn Féin delegation was carrying this yoke, and we explained to them. And I announced that we were going to put it on eBay and put it on sale to gather funds. And then we brought it into our room. And subsequently, then in came the Taoiseach and Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair. And I said, look up, this belongs to you, Tony. And we thought, and Martin said, this is the first time I've ever done this, Prime Minister. But Gerry's on his own. I'm not part of this, right? So I explained. So Blair went over and looked at it and he said, is it on? So, and we subsequently did sell it on eBay and we got money for the Sinn Féin campaign. So there you are.
Brilliant bit of campaign fundraising. Gerry Adams, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for coming this far. Thank you. Take care.